Do you know what players don't like? Playing through the story with every single character in Path of Exile 2. Recently, there were two instances where the whole story skip discussion came up once again. First, the Dropped Frames podcast, and then Neversinks Post on the infamous single letter platform. You know the one. I wanted to go over what both parties mentioned, breaking it down, and in between those takes, I will sprinkle in my own hot takes. Let's get started. Starting off with Dropped Frames episode 425, called The Future of Path of Exile 2. About an hour into their interview, it starts getting a bit spicy. Ezekiel mentions that the story pacing was good during his first playthrough of the campaign, but
That's like for a brand new player like me, the speed was fine at the beginning.
Right.
But like I could totally see myself going through the same act again with a different character and going, wow, this feels like I'm trudging through a swamp.
trudging through a swamp. That is quite the comparison. But I did play Minish Cap, so yeah, I get the feeling. The answer by Jonathan was that it might not be enjoyable in its current state and potentially feels worse because currently, as of April 2025, you go through the same 3 acts twice with every single character. He also mentions the following.
I am a believer in the idea that you can make something like this compelling enough that it is fun to play again. And part of the reason why it is because when we have leagues, there's a different thing going on with the campaign to kind of mean that, like it changes your perspective on, like what things are. In an ideal league will actually affect the content that you're playing as well. Like it'll make it feel like a different play experience.
Currently, the Esmerian wisps that were added in 0.2 are missing that something that makes an expansion an actual expansion. The wisps don't really make the campaign that much more interesting. As an example, the 3.26 expansion Settlers of Kulgur really changed how you go through the story by having the fights during the campaign, getting ore, using gold to upgrade the town, and hiring settlers. You could then ship off your ore and receive currency, early 5 links, or even good uniques before the end of the story. It was nice the first time around, going from the story to the Settlers expansion and then back to the campaign. In addition to league mechanics that should spice things up, Jonathan also said the following.
And then there's also the fact that you're playing a different character class. It has a different feel. Like there are bosses where like they feel completely different. Like there are a lot of the time there'll be situations where like, okay, you'll play a boss with one type of character, then you'll play it with another one. It just feels like a completely different thing. Like this boss, I just trivialized it. It was easy the first time I went through. This time I'm having it's like just due to the way that my character is, feels very different.
A simple comparison would be if you played Marauder in PoE 1 using Molten Strike, but then next league you played a Shadow using Mines. Drastically different playstyles with potentially different defenses. This further changes how you play through the story, fight enemies, and makes the campaign playthrough feel less like a swamp. Carnage then followed up with,
PoE is not one game. PoE is 2 distinct different games. It is the campaign and it is the end game. And a lot of people don't want to play this first one a bunch of times, but they really want to play the second one a bunch of times, which means they have to slog through the first one a bunch of times to get to the part they like.
a really good point by because when you see people play PoE 1 or 2 live on Twitch or watch any videos on YouTube, you don't really watch them play the story. You probably want to hear what the endgame is all about, best builds in the endgame, and currency farming strategies for the endgame. Not so many videos are focused on the story part. Carnage also mentions before the previous clip that playing anything or going through anything 20 times can get repetitive. Jonathan agreed with that point, but he also mentions that in the endgame you go through the same map 20 times. Quickly rebutted with that you play those 20 maps because of the new league mechanics and interactions which add to that experience.
Like you said, anything that you play through 20 times can get boring, and I don't disagree with that. But then at the same time, in the end game, you're playing through the same map 20 times. So,
But you're coming
like,
back to the season for like the new mechanics, the new changes. So you come
exactly,
back
right?
for the new stuff, but you only get to that stuff
is
in.
also available in the campaign as well. So if you're going to make the argument that
Yeah.
playing through the, like what I'm saying is like the only difference between the campaign and the end game is the order in which you play through areas is fixed in the campaign and isn't in the end game.
After that quick back and forth, Ko suggested after you do your first playthrough of the story, could future playthroughs in the same league be shorter by either showing the exits or making areas smaller so people can get through it quicker to play more characters? Jonathan answered with the following.
One of the things as far as like multiple playthroughs of within a single league is that I think that players are maybe not happy enough with the level of like power leveling items that they're getting. Because like the theory is that you play through the campaign, once you go to end game, you've got a bunch, like you get a bunch of items, and now your second playthrough is way easier because you've got a bunch of items that you got from before. And so I mean that should more than double the speed that you're going through the campaign.
Jonathan is kind of right. If you ever played into the endgame, got a few exalts, and equipped yourself with some leveling gear, or just slammed exalts on some rare items you find off of the ground, you notice that power spike. Still, Jonathan did say that players have been mentioning weak early leveling uniques, so there is still work to be done. And here is my point of view. I genuinely like the story. To preface this, I play with full sound, no major distractions, and really try to soak in the story, the visuals, and music, or at least the vibe. I do skip the dialogue now, but I still try to give each major moment in the story its attention. For example, Count Geonor asking the Hooded One to end his suffering, Sekema Asala killing Jaman-Ra and cutting off his head, the Hooded One revealing himself to be Sin, and of course, our favorite thaumaturge, Doriani. I'm someone who really started to enjoy the lore of Path of Exile over the past years, and I might have consumed every Kitten Cat Noodle video about thrice now. From a gameplay perspective, I enjoy the story because it gives me something that you lose in the endgame. Consistency. Some patches might change damage numbers and life of bosses, but overall, the experiences I had fighting bosses in the campaign with a certain build stick around. I'm not a genius and can remember everything, but a faint memory stays. I can remember fighting the Titan with my very first build in 0.1, which was a scuffed minion build. In 0.2, my league starter was the Huntress, and it was a much easier fight compared to 0.1. I can compare those experiences because the bosses aren't influenced by wacky modifiers. That's why I like the story. If we only had the endgame and random modifiers, your Jaman-Ra fight might be different compared to mine. But thanks to the story, your final boss in Act 2 is the same as mine. If I had a difficult time, but you didn't, the only variables are the skill level, the build, and the RNG of drops until that boss. I like that consistency. And from a positive perspective, if you have build A, died many times fighting Act 3 Doriani, but then play build B in the following league, and suddenly blast the Doriani off of his floating UFO thingy, doesn't that feel amazing? It does for me. Moving on to Neversink's suggestion on skipping the story or leveling a new character faster. First off, on April 14th, he posted his suggestion, I quote, "Allow converting 10 Divine Orbs into a level endgame 60 character with all quests completed. The character is of Divine origin, helps with inflation and keeps Divine Orb price up, can only be used once you have a level 80 plus character leveled, makes me happy." He also added a poll in the replies asking voters what they thought about his suggestion, and out of 7,157 voters, 48.6% voted for yes, please. I voted for no, bad. and then replied with, I quote, "Sorry, but no. That will not and should not make any sense lore-wise of why, how, or even where to do that. Any hour that goes into that idea on GGG's end would be, in my opinion, entirely wasted oxygen." Unquote. That was, to be fair, a very emotional reply. I hope Neversink didn't see it as a personal insult. It wasn't meant to be. Sorry if it came across as that. I could have been less aggressive in my writing. I needed to put my foot down and hope that he understands that his suggestion really doesn't work, at least not from a lore or story point of view. I can see his suggestion totally working in Torchlight Infinite, Lost Ark, maybe even Diablo 4, but not in Path of Exile, because it is such a grounded game. Or at least tries to be. With the Temporalis Blink build from 0.1, you were barely on the ground, but we aren't talking about that. 2 days later, Neversink followed up and pretty openly said that his suggestion was bad. He mentions 3 issues that could occur if his suggestion went through. First, having an impact upon the Divine Orb economy. Second, very out of place in terms of implementation. And third, players may receive a high-level character and be very underwhelmed. The first issue makes sense, because if people need 10 Divine Orbs, they will most likely get them through trade, and that impacts the economy. The second issue mirrors what I said. It would be very strange from a lore and story perspective. The implementation would be very messy. And the third issue is something I didn't even think about. If you just play to level 80 and then start a new character and skip the story, your power level would be all over the place and feel very strange. A bit further down, Neversink mentions that he still wouldn't want to do the story after having been in the endgame. He doesn't fault the campaign, but compares it to living again with your parents. I don't know if I agree with that comparison, but it does sound pretty bad. Neversink then wrote, I quote, "The endgame has a much more fast and fluid gameplay and progression," unquote. I agree, but here are my 2 cents. What he wrote about fluid gameplay and progression in the endgame is because you worked your way to it. You have conquered the story and earned to be faster and have more fluid gameplay. Technically, a level 1 character in PoE 2 poops on any PoE 1 character in terms of fluidness. Is that a word? So the whole power fantasy that people want in an ARPG is what PoE 2 offers right now, because you start low and go high. And not in terms of weed, because 420, which was recently. I understand though that it's just smoke and mirrors, and if you look deep into it, it's numbers. At least most of it. But I think the power fantasy we crave is more than that. It's the bosses you defeated with your build. It's the areas and enemies within that you went through. It's the sound of your build that continues to change. And from a mechanical point of view, you slowly developed muscle memory of your build as you went through the campaign, which then makes you more efficient than a few hours earlier. Doing your combos becomes easier, faster and smoother, and thus you kind of deal more damage. It becomes this beautiful package in which all these variables matter, not equally, but they are weaved together. If you can stick around for a bit more, here's a thought experiment. Let's imagine in 0.3 we have an XP rush mode with a crazy amount of increased experience, but for simplicity's sake, it's called Simulacrum, and you drop in at level 1 until level 68. Let's think about this. When you get to level 68 and level your character about 10 times faster than the story, I think you wouldn't feel anything. First, you didn't have to overcome bosses and most likely killed them in a few seconds maximum, because the point is to level fast. There might only be a small number of bosses in the Simulacrum 2, because why waste development time on bosses that shouldn't survive longer than a few seconds? You could add the act bosses from the campaign into the Simulacrum, but then why not play the campaign? But fair point, just spawn some bosses in there every few waves while you're leveling. I still think the vibe is going to be off. Count Geonor is a great fight because of everything leading up to it. It's this dissonance that you feel when you find a boss in a place that you aren't used to. It can be cool, but usually doesn't. It's like adding Diablo from Diablo to the world of Equestria. Like, what the fuck? The areas and enemies also would not feel right in the Simulacrum, because Keth is so well known for its scarab enemies. You would not experience those enemies in that area with your build. So having your build being cornered in tight corridors or being swarmed by lots of enemies in a big open area is what matters and makes it interesting. But in this experiment, that's missing. Third, the point I made earlier with sound could work in this Simulacrum. You get your levels, skills, and hear your build develop. For example, you shatter enemies with Herald of Ice after 30 or so levels, or hear your crossbow attacks shred through enemies. The sound development of your build would work depending on the sound. Technically, a crossbow should sound different in a cave compared to a big open jungle. In this Simulacrum, it would sound kind of the same all the time, because why waste development time on 100 different areas? You just wanted to get through it quickly, right? So ultimately, kinda boring. Fourth, and lastly, the muscle memory. If you ever played a build in PoE 1 or even PoE 2 for an extended period of time and then switch off of it to a new build, you might have noticed the muscle memory that you have developed. This might not work depending on how long the Simulacrum is going to be. If the Simulacrum is an hour long, I don't think you will develop that muscle memory. This single hour might actually tire you out faster because you are doing many attacks over and over. If it's 3 hours long, I can see that you start developing muscle memory of the build you're leveling. But a 3-hour long Simulacrum, non-stop, or let's just imagine a constant onslaught of enemies, is going to be rough, both on your mind and wrist. So, even if you try to give people a secondary option to leveling, which doesn't involve the campaign, but does require you to defeat enemies in this ARPG, there are still so many variables that are missing, that make leveling fun and make a great game. Sure, if you just want to see numbers go bigger, you can play games like Vampire Survivors, Nova Drift, Brotato, Geometry Arena. There are many games that can satisfy that specific need, and I love those games for a quick burst of dopamine. The 3-hour Risk of Rain 2 run isn't that quick though. Path of Exile 2 is so much more than just numbers going bigger, and that's why it has captured more players than Path of Exile 1. There is a better story, the music is phenomenal, the visuals are out of this freaking world, and more importantly to me, the gameplay. It's more fluid than ever before, it's more transparent than ever before, and visuals of your attacks look and sound incredible, making the second-to-second gameplay more enjoyable. But Path of Exile 2 is far from perfect. We humans aren't perfect. I think no game deserves a 10 out of 10, because humans create games. But trying so incredibly hard to get as close as possible to that 10 out of 10 should be rewarded, celebrated, and most importantly, the result of working to get there for years should be played and not skipped. Thanks for watching.